Hey, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. We're really lucky today to be joined by some of the most prominent thinkers in the MEV space. As you've been introduced, just want to say it's great to have you guys here, and let's get started. So I think most folks are probably familiar with the concept of MEV at this point, but maybe a little bit less so with PrimeMev and Swav. So to contextualize the conversation today, I would like to invite Tomas and Murat to just tell us a little bit about what PrimeMev and Swav are. How does it improve or change the experience for builders in the MEV space?
Yeah, sure. So Swav is a market for mechanisms in the MEV space. So we keep talking about the distribution of MEV, but also about the exclusive order flow nowadays, about privacy for users, but also decentralization of block building, connectivity to multiple domains for the possibly cross-domain MEV. But those questions are quite difficult to answer because we have so many possibilities of designing the system, the protocol, the mechanism for MEV extraction with the positive outcomes. And instead of trying to centralize even the thinking process of what mechanism is really the one that should prevail, Swav says, let's deploy a chain, and on this chain, different entities can deploy their mechanisms that describe how we would like to do the block building for different domains, how we would like to interact with the order flow, and then provide also the secure space or confidential space for users to choose what information about the transactions they would like to share with searchers, with bundlers, and then allow bundlers to interact with this entire system and choose really what of the information from the users they can introduce to their bundles, and the bundles, and all of those different chains to choose the block building mechanisms that are actually most profitable depending on latency, on the type of order flow that they can reach out for, and the type of searching activities that they allow for.
I'll add what the PrimeMev angle is to some of this. So Swav is a pretty promising platform, but my recent background was at Block Native as a product lead, and we were one of the major block builders, and I was getting lots of inquiries from searchers about how they wanted to do more, how they wanted to kind of coordinate with our block builder a little bit more, and essentially there was this area of coordination inefficiencies in MEV that the current viable framework, which is PBS, didn't quite kind of attempt to solve. PBS had higher priorities to solve. So PrimeMev was a result of the inquiries coming from the searchers to our builder at the time, and we were limited by providing services at a single block builder's kind of market share. So a block builder had 10% market share at the time at Block Native, and that meant 90% of the time we couldn't give you the execution services you were looking for. So this idea of how could we connect block builders so that searchers or other users could interact with a network of block builders and can eliminate as many of the coordination inefficiencies as possible came about, and eventually became PrimeMev through asking folks from Flashbots and the Ethereum Foundation. And we saw the advent of integrated searcher builders as a kind of workaround to solve for these coordination inefficiencies that end up centralizing the stack. So, with the advent of something like PrimeMev on top of, networks or platforms like Swav, we're hoping to kind of reduce some of these coordination inefficiencies and then increase the decentralization and access and democratization of these services and tools.
If I understand correctly, it sounds like Swav is MEV supply chain coordination infrastructure, and PrimeMev is a communication protocol between searchers and builders. And now these, to me, seem pretty unopinionated, but one of the most fascinating aspect of the MEV conversation is that it's inherently philosophical. So how do we redistribute value that is extracted by the system from its participants? And I think with the advent of MEV share and MEV burn, we're going to see more value flow back to the users. But even in that case, there are arguments to be made that that value belongs to all ETH holders or belongs to those whose actions caused the opportunity for MEV. So how do we think about fairness in this context? How will we see the MEV redistribution kind of evolve?
Darren, you want to take that one?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I guess I've spent a lot of the last year or so writing papers on and sort of like trying to define what the different fairness frameworks are. So one type of criteria, desiderata you might want is, hey, actually, we redistribute the MEV. It actually ensures that the network doesn't lose stake. So people don't unstake and move to another network. People don't take their ETH and put it somewhere else in DeFi. People don't take their ETH and give it to SBF. Like there's all sorts of these types of options that can happen. So there's a sense in which networks, like proof of stake networks, have some inherent cost to keep capital. And that's extremely important to their security. On the other hand, proof of stake, as we know it, is extremely inefficient collateral-wise, right? The network is significantly over-collateralized from the perspective of how much slashing have we actually incurred. And there's a sense in which, obviously it's safer in these, decentralized permissionless systems to be extremely over-collateralized. But over time, you see that people realize that and start finding more clever ways of reducing that. So like restaking being an example of something that's a way of proof of stake networks allowing themselves to have lower collateral ratios, where collateral ratio here means how much stake in terms of numeraire terms is actually locked in the network to secure these transactions. So that's one angle of fairness, is that the network needs to be safe, and if it's not safe, then it has inherent, like worst case fairness behavior. Another notion of fairness is, what are the utilities that users receive from the network due to MEV versus what are the utilities that validators receive, and how much do these things differ? And so, the philosophy of fairness is a very complicated topic, and I know lots of philosophers and sociologists who get angry with any definition you give. So, one kind of not controversial definition is, what's the difference between the worst case you can give a user and the average case over all the different decisions of adding or removing transactions, reordering transactions? And that type of fairness, interestingly, if you try to study it mathematically, has sort of lower bounds, which sort of means you can't really reduce it perfectly to zero. There's sort of some sense in which there's always inherently some unfairness. And so you kind of are combating these sort of different ways of redistributing MEV. Some are for the sake of keeping the network safe. Some are for the sake of making sure that there's a subsidy such that the average and worst case are not so different for a user. And I think a lot of the designs, I think the Suave philosophy is, we don't actually know what fairness means. So why don't you write something that says, for your application, here's what we, the application developer, think is probably fair for you. And if you don't like it, go use another thing.
Well, I feel that there is, for every bit component of what happens in the MEV redistribution, you can think of, if there are two competing solutions or multiple competing solutions, that you have one winner that can take that chunk for themselves and think like, I deliver some value above what the second best provider delivers, and it feels very often fair to say that that extra value is what you should be able to extract to some extent from the network. And that value can be provided to users or traders in so many different ways. So very often in conversation about MEV, we talk that it's all about backgrounds and giving money back, like paying back to the user. But it might be provided in the user experience form, like in a nice UI form. If it's a retail user, they may prefer it over the payment back, right? Which means that the entire supply chain and the entire conversion of the value may happen like from money to the experience, from experience to money, and everyone on those multiple steps of the of the providing the service for user can capture whatever they do better than others, and they also capture like this extra value that they provide by conversion to something that there is a demand for. And I think the fairness is when everyone can extract from the system the value that covers their cost of service and of like innovation and of delivery of value that others want to pay for. And a user, when they come to the network, they want to pay for the network because this network for them is better than the second best network. And the network itself then maybe extracts that difference between the network and the second best network, and so on and so on. So it is complex. It can be simplified. The MEV in the most simple way can be attributable to user signing transaction and changing the situation on chain, changing the state. So and then practically recalculating of what is the extra value resulting from the signing of transactions. So this seems like, oh yeah, pay back that to the user, maybe through different forms of paying back. There is a value that arises from outside of the chain. So what if the prices in the world of oil change and there is a synthetic asset on chain, like representation of oil, and now you have arbitrage opportunity. Someone can start trading and is in privileged position. So who do you attribute that to? Maybe like everyone on the network. So different types of MEV that will appear will be attributable to users, to protocols, to the entire network. And also then you want to redistribute it so to foster innovation and participation and long-term survival, like this fairness of the network security, but also the efficiency and the value that it delivers to users, not necessarily financial value.
One angle that's like less talked about in this context is the concept of purpose for using a network. The user might be there to fulfill a purpose of, let's say in the oil example, like they're just kind of trying to buy some, oil assets on chain, right? They didn't kind of come to that network to extract some MEV. And, as long as they're able to, fulfill that purpose in a, non-detrimental way where they don't lose on the price too much or something like that, which is obviously arbitrary. But then you can argue that user kind of fulfilled their purpose to some degree and was able to get the use out of this network that they need. So then any extra MEV that was created might then belong to the rest of the set of the actors on the network. But what's interesting about the setting is that MEV is actually universal. There are things that are happening off-chain that are affecting the MEV on-chain. So then, like, if you trade $1 million of ETH on Binance, you're actually affecting the price of on-chain like ETH. So then, because you took that action on Binance, now are Binance users entitled to some MEV because they affected what's going to happen on the chain? So the bounds of who deserves what is very gray. And I think we do need to incorporate this concept of purpose. Like, why did you decide to use this today? And did you really get that use out of the network? And if you did, then perhaps that's some level of satisfactory for you. And then the remaining abundance of resources could then be split across some of the other actors. Obviously, some of these boundaries are very arbitrary right now, but I do think we need to consider this concept of purpose when it comes to redistribution of MEV.
The sentiment on stage feels kind of neutral. Guys, this is a safe space. We can do whatever we want to. So I like to push this concept of design neutrality a little bit. I think we're leaning on a lot of economic and auction design to say, hey, well, let the free market decide how the value will flow to different involved parties in each phase of the MEV supply chain. But there is an externality to this sort of almost Rube Goldberg sort of design where there's so much complexity to solve what could have been a really simple question had we had more of a central kind of consensus around redistribution. And that externality is user experience, because the more layers that we add to the supply chain, the more latency there is. So what are some ways that we can maybe solve the problem of latency so that we can maybe find a balance between this design neutrality and impact on ultimate user experience?
I mean, I think the point, at least to me, is that that's an impossible goal. So, one of the reasons blockchains are good at permissionless behavior is that you replace latency with fees, right? At some level, you've sort of flipped the auction from a time-based auction of like, are you the first one to do something, to I have to bid. I've transformed to price space. But the problem is that there's some incoherence between things that are very good and optimal in some sense in latency space, and things that are optimal in price space. And that there's sort of this uncertainty principle type of thing that you can't be optimal in both for arbitrary payoff functions. And so if you're going to be a permissionless system that allows people to write arbitrary payoff functions that arbitrary numbers of users can get, then you can never be optimal in both. And once you accept that, then you can start trying to say what's the best you can do conditional on that.
Well, that counterbalancing the latency is the value of order flow that you can attract to the system that maybe is complex, provides system of protections and fairness and redistribution, and because of that, it's slower. But because also of that value that it provides, it attracts the order flow that feels safer in that environment. And I think then this is like a market force of, think of proposer, accepting builders coming from two different systems, one that is SWAV-based market for mechanisms that compete for fairness, for latency, for construction, and then there is a extremely centralized searcher builder running in a hedge fund, and it competes with it. So the latter one is a super low latency solution, right? It can capture this last few hundred milliseconds of latency to add additional value of order flow that is like their private exclusive order flow. But a system like SWAV can compete with that, with the order flow that wants to be safe in this environment. And I think it's the market deciding of who is better at this game. Is it the private order flow creation is like so efficient? We know everything about the chain, so we can centralize that. And then, if it's so, then why? If we know so much, then possibly you can have 2 or 3 actors doing that, and then they will be forced to pay much of this value back to the system, really, because they'll be competing at the very edge of this. But if we don't know much about the system, then there's space also for this experimentation. And I think at different stages of the life of this MEV exploration, we'll have either the space for innovation, we'll be searching of what's the ideal solution, and then we'll be coming back to the world where we choose that ideal solution, and maybe we'll start ossifying it. So yeah, that initial stage seems very complex because we are exploring, we're experimenting, we are innovating. And the simplicity comes when you have a full understanding, and this comes with time.
I have a mildly spicy take on latency. There seems to be some tribalism when it comes to latency in the community right now, where there's people who are totally like anti-latency games, and they think it's an entirely centralizing factor, which to some degree it is. And there's folks that are taking it to entirely. It should all be latency, and it should be survival of the fittest kind of way, which obviously seems a little unfair. But when we look at nature, the way nature evolves is through its own version of latency, which is speed, right? So the faster kind of evolves in a certain way, and that organism then entangles itself with the rest of the ecosystem, and the ecosystem in nature is somewhat coherent, even though there has been this survival of the fittest kind of concept. So speed is actually very fundamental to how nature operates. And I'm not saying nature is fair by any means, but I'm not particularly convinced that we should kind of get rid of speed as a concept in the systems we design, because it seems to be very fundamental how nature operates. That being said, there's definitely some medium between having a full-on like latency-based game and something that doesn't consider latency at all. And given the universality of prices and the fact that we're living in a globe and there's latency impacts of everything, price will never be equal in 2 different parts of the globe. So there's always going to be some aspect of latency that's going to come in. I think the question is not whether we should mitigate that completely or not. It's that what's the right balance between having a full-on latency game and not at all.
And I probably would add the one thing is that like the philosophical difference between people who are, we can only have apps on chain that are atomic, versus it's fine having some asynchrony, having mutexes, having multiple domains, having sort of having to have sort of bridges, having to have domains that are centralized interacting with domains that aren't, effectively means that you can never perfectly equilibrate them. In some sense, you should view bridges between blockchains as fair trade agreements. Those two chains have sort of made some type of agreement that there's going to be a relative ratio of taxation between them, which is the fee you're paying the bridge operator or however you're kind of crossing between them. And the real question is, in a permissionless environment where anyone can make these agreements between these chains, how's that a different sort of outcome than sort of nation states that negotiate these kinds of like particularized, very specialized fair trade agreements that like, you know, get adjudicated in different ways. In some sense, fairness comes down to fair trade agreements. Are they actually fair? I would say no fucking fair trade agreement in the history of this planet, of human society, has ever actually been really fair. It's fair to some subset of people, but it can't be fair to everyone, right? And in some sense, it's inherently the problem you have with this multi-domain MEV type of stuff is you have to be fucking over someone. There is a zero-sum constraint somewhere.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I do think this is an underrated kind of school of thought that doesn't get highlighted often enough.
Sometimes the entry into a new market itself is an extractive process. So there's definitely some, to Tarun's point earlier, like fairness is such a complex idea that you could say, hey, if two parties agree to something, then like who are we to judge? But at the same time, what are some of the ultimate like motivations and who benefits the most? And speaking of who benefits the most, we'd love to kind of stay on Murat's idea of competing along the vector of speed and latency, and maybe broaden that to all of the vectors of competition. So as we see, layer twos are really coming to a spring as part of the 3 transitions article, that one of those transitions is more users are going to move to rollups. And we're seeing a difference in approach with each rollup. Optimism is going with more of an MEV auction. Arbitrum is going with more fair sequencing, and ZK Sync wants to capture MEV and return it to users. How do we think that different approaches will complex the fair trade agreements of bridges between these ecosystems, and which design is going to potentially win out?
Do people move their nationality or jurisdiction to avoid taxes? This is the same question, right? Because these are just choosing different types of taxes on users, right? I'm returning the MEV to users versus returning the MEV to a staking pool or to a sequencer or restaking pool. I mean, obviously once restaking is live, I think that's when you're going to start seeing the same types of effects you see with MEV leading to particular staking pools dominating. Is that, it's a question of who gets the tax revenue. And like, yeah, people are going to jurisdiction hop. And those trade agreements are basically ways of arbitraging the tax rates at some level. There's no way around that in some sense. The difference is that in the permissionless environment, you can construct new ways of arbitraging tax rates. Whereas in the permissioned real life environment, it's very hard to arbitrage tax rates. You have to change your nationality. You have to stop paying the IRS and hope they don't try to send the Navy after you. It's like,
if we're all like quantitative thinkers in real life, we'd all be living in the Cayman Islands now. So I think people
right. Purpose is important. Living in shitholes is that you don't not living in shitholes is a form of purpose.
Yeah. I mean. That took a different turn, but I think at the end of the day, we, this came up a lot when we had the discussions between, sharing some MEV with users for the first time, because the pipeline was entirely share, as much revenue as possible with proposers, and then this idea of kind of MEV share came about, and what if we could provide some kickbacks to users, and I was part of Block Native still, and thinking as a block builder, I was like, well, if I'm creating 2 blocks where I'm giving all of the revenue to the proposer on one, and I'm giving some of the revenue to the user on the other one, which one is the proposer going to pick? And the answer is obvious, and it has actually sort of played out that way. But the argument, the counter argument, which came from Flashbots, which was credible, was that by giving users more kickbacks, eventually you're going to gather more order flow, and more users are going to come back to that, and it will kind of counterbalance what the proposer would make otherwise by sharing some revenue. I think some of the latest data has shown that the kickbacks haven't been particularly large enough for it to play this out, although the theory still holds, and maybe in a bull market we'll see that with more volume. But at the end of the day, if we go back to kind of two chains being there, and one is giving it to the users and the other just has more favorable tax laws, I think we all know where people are going to flock eventually. But Suave may be one solution that actually kind of bridges that gap a little bit, where it might actually gather enough order flow for the Suave kind of solution and the Suave pipeline to provide better outcomes that proposers end up picking. I just don't think we're at the place in the market right now, or maybe it's the cycle, maybe it's the level of activity and adoption, that those kind of economies of scale have really come to fruition for the theory to play out in practice.
Well, we started talking about MEV on Ethereum mainnet after some time, right? When DeFi appeared, when we had already stable coins, or at least we started talking about it much louder. And this is also because we were already witnessing some of the negative behaviors on chain. We've seen the gas price going up excessively because of all the hammering of the chain with transactions. And L2s now are very often not yet in those places. So they tackle a lot of hard engineering and research problems. And they also look at decentralization, and they start looking at MEV. And they're at different stages, and they have different roadmaps and ordering of those problems to solve. And also they have different approaches. So they'll be competing with the quality of research and quality of offering to the user. And yes, this is choosing the network based on entirety of what it has to offer to you. Like, is it liquidity, the way it handles MEV, how secure it feels, how decentralized it feels, and so on and so on. And maybe you have one winner in the end on the liquidity side, but you may have multiple winners on the different types of value that you can take from the chain, right? That might be gaming, it might be finance, it might be something else, might be privacy. So we work with the L2s, trying to explain them what those different approaches are, helping them with research, because very often they're just starting to look at it, and maybe the same way as we were illuminating that for the mainnet users and for mainnet protocol designers, the same way we now working with the L2 designers and telling them these are the problems that you don't see yet, and that's why you may feel a bit overly comfortable, but you most likely will witness those further down the lines. So start thinking about it now. We can help you build proof of concepts. We can help you to choose, and there is some level of experimentation and innovation and comparing what the results really are.
So I guess my more, I don't know if it's a hot take, but I actually think all of these things are going to end up being commoditized anyway. Like, I don't think there's actually going to be some dominant roll-up. Partially because everyone wants to move to these like hybrid off-chain, on-chain aggregation models, right? Like, I guess intent is a buzzword, but like SwapX is a great example of this, where honestly, if I'm a filler, I don't really give a shit where I fill the thing for the user. The user doesn't even give a shit themselves. If they had an MPC wallet that's controlling where I basically have I'm controlling keys on all these chains with like a single wallet, I don't really care that much, right? Like we're kind of trying to move to this abstraction where user wants to buy Pepe. User doesn't care if their Pepe is an Arbitrum or Optimism. And I actually think in general the move to this slightly more off-chain model actually completely gets rid of any monetary premium that a lot of roll-ups can actually hold over the long term.
Yeah, I mean, idealistic, theoretic world, then the user can just say abracadabra, and then things just happen auto-magically for them.
But I think the interesting thing is the roll-up developers don't think about this, right? They honestly don't really know much about their users often. But the application developers are the ones who are fucking analyzing the user behavior. And the user behavior is actually the reason that you're seeing applications go to these kind of off-chain fulfillment mechanisms. And in some sense, if that commoditizes the rollups, I don't think the users are ever going to learn any of these types of values.
Yeah, I definitely see that future being kind of the end game form factor. And between now and then, there's going to be a lot of debates between parties that have interest in kind of securing their piece in the pie. And kind of going back to what Tomas was saying earlier, the kind of collaboration platform between the different layer 2s is like one way for users to get more utility out of the MEV ecosystem. And to name a few, for example, to enable cross-chain like flash loans, to enable more reliable synchronous cross-chain swaps. So there is this kind of this tension between users who may get the most kickback by going with a private order flow, or maybe getting more utility out of the more open, collaborative MEV supply chain platforms. How do we think about this?
I think users are going to be like few levels abstracted from all this. Even like more sophisticated users, like people in this audience, are going to be 2 to 3 levels kind of abstracted from it. And when you can use kind of traditional like real world analogies for this. Like when we order food, like, yeah, there's some restaurant on my Grubhub app that really invested in their chairs and their lighting in their restaurant. But like, I'm just hungry and I'm gonna press a couple buttons and then like some person's gonna show up with some food at my door. And yeah, it's nice that that restaurant has some really nice chairs, but like, I don't really care. I just wanna be like fed. So I do think it's gonna play out like that, similar to like what Tarun said about like some of these places aren't really thinking about the user. But the application in this analogy, which is the food, kind of cares, right? As long as the food's tasty, I don't care if it comes from, like New York City is a great example for this. There's like some restaurants that are literally rated C, and you'll like see it on their window, but you know the dim sum's so good that you're just gonna go there and like eat that. And yeah, maybe sometimes it's a turnoff, but like, every once in a while you're just like there and you don't really care as long as the food is good.
I'm not sure if people in Singapore know what a New York health rating C restaurant is.
That's a good call. So in New York, you have these A, B, C rated restaurants, and it's prominently displayed in the front door of the restaurant, usually the health rating of the restaurant. And often you go to Chinatown and there's nothing that's A rated, but you have some really good Chinese food, and that's a trade-off you're willing to make because you're there for the food. You're not there particularly for how the restaurant owner designed the restaurant, etc. So yeah, I hope that analogy ended up making sense.
Fun fact: if you can still get an A, even if the inspector finds a rat in your kitchen, you just can't have any other infractions. You can have a rat found in your kitchen during the inspection and still get an A.
There you go. And
that should tell you what a C is.
Yeah, I think the analogy for the rat in this case is like toxic MEV, right? Like you're okay getting sandwiched if you're able to get Pepe at the good price, right? Like you don't care about getting sandwiched.
So we're gonna make a meme coin called Dim Sum Rat. That's like what
I'm with it.
Exciting how far we've gone with this. Yeah, so coming back from here, I think that's the matter of choice, and the user chooses based on their user experience and maybe, I don't know, like the long-term conditions, security, health, and tastiness, and so on. But if this is all hidden, then you pay for every level of abstraction. If you can do something yourself and optimize it, then you have access to all the market data and all the execution venues as a user. If you're a super sophisticated trading shop, then you will not pay for someone doing that for you because it will be less efficient. For a majority of retail users, this will be probably better efficiency because you don't have this outreach. It's a bit like with the Solo validators versus the pools, and we try to build the systems that kind of balance it out and give as much efficiency to the retail users and Solo validators in MEV chain. What happens in the background well, users may not care where that liquidity is between all the different L2s, but I'm not sure that the liquidity likes to be fragmented. It will follow like the best patterns, and then all those intents, all those abstractions may end up redirecting you to the single place over and over again. And the user will not care, but it will maybe not necessarily commoditize those L2s, but it will actually monopolize the L2s, because we'll say, well, whenever you redirect for efficiency, you always land in this one place. And then you need to have some specialization, or maybe there'll be some inefficiencies that will keep some L2s to last for a bit longer.
Now I can't get the image of a rat meme coin out of my mind.
I mean, have you seen New York City rats? Like, they're made for meme coins.
Yeah, I mean, they're great to practice your agility by just hopping around to dodge them. Utility.
Yeah, I guess I'd add one other thing about Suave. I actually think the irony is that the intent model may actually make Suave more valuable than the rollups themselves. It sort of like trades off their power, because if, say, rollups kind of lose their individual bargaining and they kind of have to agree to the collective bargaining of like, hey, we agree to some ordering rule or some extra consensus rules to exactly how transactions are added or reordered, that sort of means that the Suave producers, sort of as decentralized block producers in some sense, have a lot more power over where that liquidity goes for fillers, because fillers are going to be like looking at the ordering rules and choosing which ordering rule actually gives them the highest P&L. And so there's a sense in which, yeah, I agree that the liquidity fragmentation can be a problem, but as we saw with Pepe, it was like, if we look at the distribution of MEV of that coin, it's actually split across many places, and a lot of the users didn't seem to care that much. Pepe is a particularly good case study of what really like degen user thinks about or doesn't think about.
For sure, efficiency of bridging, right? So if it takes me a lot of effort and cost to bridge between one chain and the other, and I already have assets on one chain, then this fragmentation of liquidity will keep happening. So whenever we see that some of the L2s are striving for the super efficient bridges, extremely smooth bridges with decentralized sequencing, making bridging atomic, and so on and so on, what it leads to is probably liquidity centralized, like getting together in one place, because, well, it's so easy to move it around. I can now keep all my peppers in one place, and the pepper price is less affected by trading. But the bridges for now are very inefficient, are insecure, are costly, are like we have trouble to track the liquidity across the different chains. There might be different VMs on different chains, and the user fans are fragmented, right? So I may not always be able to trade in the execution venue that I want, and to move there may be very expensive.
Speaking of bridging, in the world where transactions become more atomic cross-chain, and with the communication protocol that can add programmability to transactions, what roles will bridges and like cross-chain message protocols play?
I see them as kind of like a lubricant for all of this to happen a little bit more efficiently. They're just going to be like core infrastructure, like the real life bridges that we have. You know, at the end of the day, you're trying to go from place A to B, and you know that bridge is there. Sure, you'll pay a fee, but you know you're going to use an Uber, for example, right? Like, and you're going to be on that Uber, and that Uber is going to pay the fee to the bridge, right? So you know something like PrimeEv or Suave could be the Uber in this case, where you know you have some intent, again, for lack of a better word, and you know you convey that in some shape or form, whether that's a bid or whether that's some AI interface that you say, hey, look, I want some Pepe coins, like figure it out for me, and then you know the series of middleware that are going to come into play, and you know different kind of MetaMask snaps or whatever else kind of new middleware that comes up, they're all going to kind of play their part, and eventually you're going to get that Pepe coin. And so I think that's how it's going to play out, and then all the bridges and the kind of the messaging and communication middleware are all going to play their part in that stack, and to fulfill the purpose of getting the user their Pepe at the end of the day. And so I think we can anticipate more activity when it comes to these tools and middleware. But I think over time they're going to kind of be buried deeper and deeper into the stack where people don't interact with them as much. Like you might not actually go to a bridge site in order to bridge your coins. You might, that might just happen inherently as you're swapping something on Uniswap.
That's a really interesting vision where like the messaging protocols are kind of the GPS and bridges remain bridges, and then kind of these cross-chain transaction facility become the Ubers, for lack of better words, to get users from like one city to another, where we finally have more of interconnected cities.
Yeah, I think that's increasingly what people are going to deal with.
I would actually say, how many people in this room have used a Telegram bot? One of the Unibot, Banana, whatever. I saw some people put their hands up and then down, so you're the real degens. But I think the interesting thing about that is a lot of them seem to actually, obviously the first ones were extremely degen. People were pasting seed phrases into Telegram and doing things that, words that aren't in the Bible level. But the interesting thing is a lot of them have moved now to basically use third-party multi-sig wallets that have permissioning, so like Fireblocks, turnkey style things. And, you own one of the key shares, or you own some of the key shares, and you own key shares for an MPC wallet that's on multiple places, and you don't even bridge. The trading bot's actually just fulfilling and showing you your portfolio as like you own 1 Pepe, but actually you own 0.25 ARB Pepe, 0.75 Optimism Pepe. But it's like the user doesn't even know that that's happening, and they're not even going across a bridge. They're actually just having sort of client-side management in their wallet. And so I actually think there'll be a tension between the bridges and the client-side wallet cryptography getting better, between state proofs, things like Axiom, between MPC wallets getting a lot better and some of the improved communication complexity of a lot of MPC protocols. We may actually see people minimally using bridges, like very, very minimally. Like it's, it's a high traffic time, I have to take a bridge. But otherwise, I don't know, I'll let my MPC wallet deal with it. Because some of the chatbot interfaces are actually, I've been quite impressed by them. They like have ChatGPT generate like some nonsense about they clearly have like done some minor fine tuning. They like say, okay, like here's what the chatbot says you should do to get your Pepe, yes or no. And it's a totally different experience, to the point that the user just never sees. The user probably doesn't even know to bridge. I would love to go give a survey to Unibot users and ask them how many of them know what a bridge is. I bet you it's not that many.
A great point. I mean, they're even abstracted from the wallet at that point, right? So they're not even interacting with the wallet directly. So I think it puts the case in point very well.
That's really interesting from like the maybe question of like, do users not care or do they not know? And one of the aspects of like bringing more transactions on chain is all of a sudden you sort of have this historical record of with how each party in the supply chain is behaving, and could there be even a reputation system for folks who are misbehaving, and what is this new level of transparency kind of enable us to do, and how do we kind of pair that for the need for privacy? Because like for users, if you can keep your transaction intents private, then there's no way for another actor to devise a strategy to extract anything out of a black box. So now we have this ultra transparent like new infrastructure with obviously need for privacy. Where do we go from here?
I think that maybe towards the reputation market idea. So when any reputation can be really quantified if you have very, very efficient representation of the reputation on chain, right? So you can use reputation for collateralization. Someone can tell you like, oh, you have to collateralize that loan with $1 million, but actually your reputation is worth $500,000 and the rest you have to pay with some coin. And it means, well, you can waste your reputation easily, but you can also trade it. You can decide to totally trade your reputation and do something malicious for a one-off gain, and then it's forever lost. So if you have that efficiency on chain, on tracking all the claims, all your certifications, examinations, all your past trades, then any trading venue can value your reputation, tell you how much of a loan you can take. And if you don't repay that loan, then you're probably lost forever. So maybe reputation market becomes like, hopefully we don't trade it in the end. There is something more on reputation than just a financial aspect. But in MEV trading, it's only this. So we cannot really do anything that's related to identity. You only see a trading bot or activity, and this thing can trade reputation.
So yeah, I agree with that mostly, but one interesting thing about these Telegram bots is there's sort of this aggregative and disaggregative effect to reputation. So if I have reputations for the Telegram bot developer, like let's suppose they have a contract deployed to a particular site, all transactions end up touching that particular call site. You're now sort of talking about the reputation of this developer on fulfilling intents for many users over many transactions, and you're sort of aggregating their reputation. It's not just self-interest reputation. It's also interest of getting new users. So there's sort of, I could imagine a world, I'm not saying this is likely, but like the app developers are the ones whose reputations matter the most, right? Like the Unibots of the world really are the people who have to like prove that they get you good fulfillment, and like they don't often send you messages with a sad face saying we couldn't get you your thing.
One thing I'd like to add to the privacy point is, we've seen privacy solutions and even like some basic solutions like sending private transactions to block builders not live up to the premise that they tell. And there's some research that came out recently that shows up actually private transactions. They wanted to avoid being front run, which is why they sent it privately. But because block builders arrange the blocks in a certain manner and put the bundles up top, they actually ended up being front run by like all of the MEV in the block. And when you think of like encryption and decryption mechanisms, it kind of pushes MEV to the point that before the transaction gets encrypted and right after it gets decrypted. And then you have some research that came out that shows some probabilistic MEV snipers, where even in environments where they don't know what's going on, they have some upstream information where the price of X is crashing on Binance, so I know all of the holders of X on chain are going to be try to sell on chain. So I'm just going to like send some blind front run orders in hopes that some of them will capture some of these sales, even though I don't particularly know that these sales are happening. And you see that some of these end up capturing some pretty sizable orders and extracting MEV that way. So I think if we continue down this path of privatizing things, we're going to see some pretty clever and interesting methods where people go upstream to find information. People come up with kind of statistical, blind front running strategies, etc. It'll be super interesting to see how these play out. But I don't think making things private is a end all be all for avoiding MEV or kind of toxicity when it comes to the MEV.
Yeah, privacy is not necessarily a panacea for the following reason. Almost all financial transactions have to have some public information that's aggregative, like a price, interest rate, fee. And even if the input to the function that computes the aggregation, like the price, the fee, the interest rate, is operating on private data, it's still posting some public thing. And there's always some amount of information in the public thing, unless it's literally generated by a delta function or is like perfectly uniform, that tells you something about the private data, right? And so you're always going to have this trade-off if there's some public aggregative thing, right? So like that's why there's no such thing as a real private intent, because hey, look, someone has to fulfill it, which means they're going to move a price somewhere. And if they move a price somewhere, someone can statistically notice that and try to associate it to new address holders. I do think, however, as much as it's still a pipe dream, the true only way to really get as close as possible to sort of the theoretical limit of leaking the minimal information is still FHE. I think like ZK, there's always some extra public information. Ts, I mean, like, I don't know, they get hacked all the time. So it's like, I agree, practically speaking, you have to use them, but like, we're not really going to get anywhere near the information theoretic limit unless you have FHE.
I agree with that. Where do you think we are on the timeline of kind of having viable FHE solutions?
You know, I like every year going and trying and benchmarking the current FHE library. And look, I did a FHE of a 1-layer neural net using Zama's library in like hour and a half, which is a huge improvement. Before I would like add 30 integers and then, you know, took the floor function and it took like an hour. So I think like FHE is actually making a lot of progress. I think the nice thing is we're going to end up using a lot of trusted execution environments and prod like Flashbots is doing. And then once FHE is ready, you're going to roll over. I think like it's the natural transition. There's no way around it. Ts are the only way to do things practically. It's just they're just very ugly, right? Like every hack is a thing that reveals the private input. Like
we do see Ts as placeholders for FHE, I think. We want to design the systems, the architecture, and show you like that one place where the privacy will have to be matched with computation on that private input. And probably the interfaces remain mostly the same. So we can safely design those MEV systems or whatever systems with enclaves and hoping for FHE. And I think, yes, recently we see some advancement and it gives a lot of hope and we're all getting more excited about FHEs.
Really enjoyed this multi-threaded conversation with everyone here today. I hope we'll get another chance to pick up where we're leaving it. Thank you so much for sharing all your thoughts with us.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.